Hey, everybody, and welcome back to the Chaplaincy on the Go podcast. I'm your host, Josh Zorhoff, and I'm a teaching pastor and a therapist in the West Michigan area. And this podcast is brought to you by the Fearless family of churches and my good friends at Care Portal. Joining me today is Dave McGovern back in the studio here to talk about intimacy. So we're going to dive into marriage and intimacy. And Dave, welcome back to the podcast and tell us what are we going to lean into today?
It's great to be here, Josh. And yeah, today we're talking something that's vital for our marriages, and that's intimacy. And I think it's really important that we understand that there are multiple buckets and streams of intimacy. When a couple sits down with me and they say, we want to grow in our intimacy, that's one of our goals. That's why we want to talk to a therapist. I say, well, what do you mean by intimacy? And typically, not all the time, but typically like, well, our sex life or sexual intimacy. But when I ask them, how is your emotional intimacy? How's your intellectual intimacy? How's your physical touch, non-sexual intimacy? Because those are part of the buckets. They look a little confused of like, well, what do you mean? And so I think it's important for this conversation today to talk about how there are multiple ways in which we connect with our spouse. And every story's different, every couple's different. But there's enough research and enough life experience where we can understand how there's multiple streams that make up the wide river of intimacy.
I'm really glad that you bring up the different categories or buckets as we refer to them. I know I've done the same thing in my counseling practice. And when we were talking about just this conversation with couples, it does become a bit of a surprise that when I talk to couples about intimacy, they're like, oh yeah, we have no problem in that category. Like we're totally fine. And they're completely referring to their sex life. Mm-hmm. And while that's great, the reality is, intimacy is a five-fold dynamic within the marriage. You have sexual, you have the physical non-sexual, you have emotional, you have intellectual, and you have spiritual. And the reality is they all work together. Mm-hmm. And so let's break it down. We're going to maybe keep the sexual intimacy conversation for last, mm-hmm. but talk us through why physical non-sexual is so important and critical in a relationship.
Yeah, well, there's just a ton of research that points to the positive interactions and the need to experience physical touch within the marriage where there's no expectation, pressure that it's leading to some type of sexual experience later on. Not that that's okay if that happens, but that there is hand-holding, that there's cuddling. There's actually some really great research on what a 20-second hug can do. Yep. Raising oxytocin levels and just feeling safe. A 6-second kiss, like some of those little intentional things, those micro touches throughout the week actually build into feeling safe, feeling seen, and can actually improve sexual intimacy. But that's not necessarily the goal. It's just connection, it's safety. And so whether that's a back rub, whether that's sitting close on the couch, holding hands, right? I hear of so many times in sessions about this 3-to-2 dynamic, which is essentially there's two people and three screens. Mm. And the amount of times people say, like, I just feel so distant from my spouse, but we're sitting on the couch. There's some television show on, and then they're both looking at their screens. Yep. That's not connecting. No. That's not engaging in the physical touch. So it could be cuddling, it could be holding hands. And we find ways to do that creatively throughout a given week, and it builds our connection and builds into our intimacy.
I worked with a couple, probably a year ago or so, where they were in the desire of wanting to build that intimacy. And, I said 20-second hug, and she's like, wait, can I say 20-second hug with hands above the waist? And what she was saying is like, I want the connection and I want the hug, but like, when you grab my rear end, that makes me feel like you don't just want connection, you want something more.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really important too. Like you can have more, but it's okay to just say, but I want this, like I want
Mm-hmm.
connection. And that's really important. So the physical non-sexual is critical, but why is the emotional intimacy? And what are some examples of that?
Yeah, emotionals is very vital as well, because in our busy and hurried lives, especially if you have kids, but you don't have to have kids to feel incredibly hurried and rushed. And especially if both spouses are working, and you throw kids into it, there's just a lot of stuff that you have to accomplish, that you have to keep straight in a given day and a given week, that we actually just kind of lose emotional connection with our spouse. Some people refer to it as like, I just feel like we're roommates running this business of kids on top of maybe running businesses outside of the home. And we can slowly just start to feel lonely in the same place from an emotional standpoint. And so it's really important to check in. Hey, how are you feeling? Are you stressed? What are you stressed about?
Right.
What'd you go through today?
Right.
What's been going on? Hey, if you've been listening to the podcast and you have some language around, hey, what's really going on? What are you holding? What feels insecure? Hey, how did you experience joy the last couple of days? Did I just creating a space for your spouse to say, hey, this is what I have been feeling. You're not going into it trying to fix it.
No.
Sometimes it's actually even helpful to like lay the land of the context of saying, hey, we're not fixing anything right now. We're just being heard.
Yeah. I talked with a wife, maybe a week ago, and she said that her husband was going through a lot of stress at work. And he said, hey, can we go out on a date? And he basically just said, I'm feeling pretty stressed. Like I'm feeling pretty overwhelmed. And she was like, that was so great. Like not great that he was stressed out, not great that he was overwhelmed, but it was so great to be able to hear about that, to be able to share that. And I do find, and this is true, men have less words to explain their emotions than women do, statistically speaking. And it's important to be able to build that language. And so in the podcast notes, we got a worksheet where you can actually maybe think through some of the things that happen throughout your day and some of the ways to process through the emotions of that, because it's really important to share that with your spouse. Even if you have to write that down on your phone or put it in a journal or share a marriage journal where you can write some of those things where it's safer to write that out. Sharing your emotions is critical to keeping that relationship going. At the same time, having an intellectual intimacy where you're sharing new things that you're learning, sharing something you heard in a podcast or something you read or something that you watched on the news or something that you learned throughout the day, or maybe a new training program that they have at work. I mean, Christy will often share with me things that, she's learning about, whether she's the co-president of the Teachers Association or the Teachers Union. And so she'll share with me new things that she's learning about the contract or new things that she's learning about the way that like contract negotiation works or whatever that is. And those are what some psychologists call bids for connection, where she shares information and I have this perspective of like, hey, tell me more about that. Yeah. I want to learn more about that. And sometimes I'll get all nerdy on Star Wars or something like that. And she'll, play along and say, well, tell me more about that. I mean, she's learned a lot more about Star Wars and superheroes in the last few years. I remember when I got into barbecue and I was like, yeah, I want to try these new recipes and do this, buy this wood and all of this. And, she really didn't care, but she said, tell me more. And it was a way for us to grow in our intellectual intimacy.
Yeah. And you bring up a really important point that all of those bids for connection are invitations to connect, which build into our intimacy. Because when there's a bit of connection, we can say like, I don't want to talk about that, or that sounds stupid, or ignore it. Right? Like we're there, but we're not there. And so I think it's important, especially with the intellectual intimacy, to understand that you're wanting to understand why your spouse likes something, what it does for them, it does not mean that you have to adopt or join in and participate in all the hobbies, interests that your spouse has, right? Like, so Christy doesn't have to become a barbecue master.
No.
You don't have to join the board at the school that she's on, right?
No.
Or if you're really into tying your own flies and fly fishing, your spouse doesn't have to do that with you. But what's really key is sharing, like, why? What is it? When did you start enjoying Star Wars? When did someone start fly fishing? What does it do for them, right? And it helps you understand and see your spouse. And so whether it's a podcast or a book or anything interesting that you kind of just have imagination about, for you to be able to say why it's moving to you, why it's exciting, and for your spouse to hear that and to say, oh man, tell me more. What are you going to do with that? Or why is that interesting?
Totally.
Is really, really helpful conversations. And they can actually build into even sharing the emotional side of, like, this is what I feel like when I don't know, when I get a sweet new lightsaber, this is why it's cool. And what's fun about that?
Everything's fun about that,
yes.
Dave.
Yeah,
it's true. One of I think probably my best memory of that is for my birthday, Christy bought me the dark saber, and it's the official Galaxy's Edge, came in the Disney box, all the things, and she doesn't even watch like all of the episodes of The Mandalorian.
Right. Sure.
I don't even think she knows what the darksaber is, but she knew that it was important to me. And that's part of it is like, it actually means more to me that she doesn't really care about that the same way I do, but she bought it anyway. And that's what we're talking about when we talk about intellectual intimacy. It's saying, you know what? I care about you enough to see the world through your eyes. And I want to know, I actually want to know what jazzes you, what gets you going when it comes to life, shared hobbies, interests, all of that. And so those are really important. There is the dynamic, though, of the spiritual intimacy. And Dave, I'm hoping that you can maybe riff on this for a little bit and talk to us about how do we, first of all, why do we need spiritual intimacy and how do we cultivate that in our marriage?
Yeah. In our marriages, it's vital to understand that at the center of it can be Jesus. He's the head of that relationship and can bind you together. And even we may get into this a little bit, but even our sexual intimacy is a form of spiritual intimacy. But it's taking our life with Jesus and saying, here's maybe how I'm experiencing my spirituality and I want to share it with you. And so that can look like all sorts of different things. It could be praying together. It could be reading a devotional together. It could be joining a small group together. Anything that engages the spiritual side individually, but saying this is a we thing that we do together with Jesus.
So when we want to grow in our spiritual intimacy, praying together, reading the Bible together, listening to worship together, going to church together, serving together, being in community groups, essentially what we're saying is that we are pursuing Jesus together. Right. And I heard it once said, maybe you've seen the triangle too, of like, if I'm over here and my spouse is over here and we're pursuing Jesus together, then we're also getting closer to each other. And there's this really profound mystery of like, when we both pursue Jesus, it somehow brings us closer together. I remember years ago, I was working with a couple that was in tremendous conflict and they were struggling. They were really going through it. And they started going to church together. They had never been to church together, and they started attending a church service together. And within 2 weeks, their whole relationship dynamic changed. I mean, the next time I saw them, they were like bouncing practically into the church holding hands. And I was just like, yo, what changed? And they weren't really able to like drill it down until they finally came to the part of like, you know what? Like we started going to church together. Mm-hmm. And I'm not saying that that is going to be your, end all be all. I'm not saying that that's going to just completely fix all of the problems. I am saying, however, and research backs this up, that 1 out of 2,100 couples that regularly pray together and pursue Jesus together, their marriage ends in divorce. 1 out of 2,100. I mean, it is less than 1%. And there is a profound reality that is statistically proven that if you are, in fact, regularly engaging with Jesus, with your spouse, growing in your spiritual intimacy and connectedness, praying for each other, it drastically diminishes your rate of divorce and overall increases marital satisfaction and sexual satisfaction. And you have more fun on date nights. And I can show all of that research if you want to get like more information on that, or you don't believe me, which is totally fine. But that is all true of spiritual intimacy.
Mm-hmm. And all the things that we've just mentioned, you're not just tapping into the power of the Holy Spirit that each individual has. You're putting Jesus at the center of that and drawing closer to that. And at the end of the day, Jesus wants union with us day in and day out. And when we can do that individually, but also with our spouse, it creates a powerful dynamic where things that we've mentioned before, the benefit of the doubt, it's filtered through Jesus and the spiritual life of our marriage.
Absolutely.
And it can change our perspective. It can change our posture of being willing to show grace and mercy and to be softer with our spouse, that on our own strength, let's just be honest, like sometimes we don't do that very well.
No. I'm so glad that you brought that up. And I'm glad that that you speak to kind of the reality that it's hard. It's hard sometimes to have this kind of intimacy. It's hard sometimes to have this kind of union. But it's critical. And now, like, as we wrap up here, Dave, I do think it's important for us to touch on just the reality of sexual intimacy and why that's so important. So I'm gonna kick it off to you and just let you talk a little bit, and then we can add in some practical kind of realities as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure. Like I said earlier, I think sexual intimacy is actually a form of spiritual intimacy. There are theologians who have said that we were, as humans, we were sexual before we were sinful. That this is sort of tied into the fabric of this marriage blessing, is that we get to be drawn back to our spouse, and that we have a physical and spiritual sexual experience with them that draws us back together. There's some Hebrew words that it actually means to fuse together. And so that's this deeply worshipful and spiritual experience that also can be pleasurable and fun.
I love that. And as we're wrapping up here, I just want to touch on the fact that all of these work together. Sexual, physical, non-sexual, emotional, intellectual, spiritual, they all run together. They are all vital components of a healthy, thriving, intimate relationship. And if you're wanting to grow in these areas, again, we have the worksheet that's available to you. There's a lot more in the resources that are available in that with the podcast notes. And we'd love to continue on this conversation, and we will as we talk about ways to grow spiritually with your spouse in our next episode. But for now, if you've got any questions on this, feel free to email us at fearlessfollower, chaplaincy@fearlessfollower.org, or go to our website, fearlesschaplaincy.org. And if you've got any questions for Dave or for me, we'd love to continue to connect on that and help with that in any way. That's all we have for you now. We will talk with you later.